When you hear explanations about what a portrait lens is, you'll hear things like it's got to do with the focal length or the background blurriness or sharpness. And they all kind of miss the point, which is strange because the answer's been around since the birth of photography. What is a portrait lens? Let's bust some myths and find out. Can any lens be a portrait lens? There are some careers that have been built on taking portraits without using a traditional portrait lens. Bill Brandt and Platon used wide angles, and paparazzi, they usually rely on long telephotos out of necessity. Pictures like those stand out because they're an exception to the rule. So what's the rule? If we want flattering portraits, something that a client would pay for and be complimented by and be happy with, we'd have to narrow the selection of lenses we use down. Of course, you could take a portrait with a short lens to give a less flattering perspective, or with a slow zoom if you bump up the ISO. You can do whatever you want. All lenses will take a portrait, but that doesn't mean all lenses are portrait lenses. That's something quite different. Here's another myth. Prime lenses are portrait lenses because they're sharper than zooms. That might have been true in the 1980s, 1990s, when zooms were genuinely trash, but that's not the case anymore. Modern zooms are sharp as a tack. In fact, they might be too sharp. Until recent history, a sharp lens was considered unflattering for portraits because it tends to hardness and gives an unpleasant effect. Softer renderings of the human face were preferred, and that's why soft focus lenses existed. You don't really see soft focus lenses in camera manufacturer lens lineups anymore because people demand equal sharpness all over the plane of the image, even though they really don't know why they're demanding it. Even after the picture's been taken in software, I'm usually nudging the clarity down a little bit in post-production on a portrait, unless it's intentionally a dramatic one. That really depends on your style to some degree. Even back to the Renaissance, Rembrandt would have pushed the clarity slider up for a more moody, dramatic portrait, and Da Vinci would have slapped Rembrandt's hands and pulled it all the way back down to flatter the sitter. All that to say, sharpness isn't the be-all and end-all of a portrait, and the sharpness of a zoom is absolutely satisfactory. So you can have a zoom that is a portrait lens, but it always has one downside. There'll always be a prime out there that has a faster aperture than your zoom. Here's the next myth, and it's related to the first one to some degree. Portrait lenses are of a certain focal length. That statement is almost there. We're getting closer to the answer. Focal length is just how much of a scene is visible, and that's almost irrelevant when you start thinking about perspective. Linear perspective for photography works a lot like the inverse square law for light. Most of the dramatic changes take place at short distances. A picture taken 12 inches from the face looks very different to one taken 6 feet away. At 12 inches, your nose is relatively close to the camera and your ears and the back of the head are relatively far away. But when the camera is 6 feet away, the distance between your nose and your ears is minuscule compared to the distance to the camera. And by the time you've gone 6 feet away, moving any further, you're in the land of diminishing returns as far as perspective goes. Distance matters, but I had the same lens on the camera, so focal length doesn't really do anything other than change how magnified the subject is when it hits the sensor. And that's the important thing. It's the perspective you get with camera to subject distance. For full frame photography, an ideal portrait lens for something like a 3/4 or a headshot is going to be between 50mm and 105mm, because then you stood at the correct distance from the subject to get the shot. All right, how about this one? Portrait lenses have wide apertures to blur out the backgrounds. We're getting close now. This one's correct, but for the wrong reasons. This dates back to the birth of photography, and let's put ourselves in a Victorian studio. We've got no electric flash available just yet, and we've got this beautiful northern light pouring through a studio skylight. We've got an f/15 or an f/16 lens made by Chevalier. Our dry plate has the equivalent of ISO 3 or ISO 1. Not 100, we're talking 1. We're not getting direct sun into the studio, so the sunny 16 rule doesn't quite work. It's probably 4 or 5 stops darker than that. There's literature that says photographers were exposing for about 30 minutes, and that's likely because it wasn't full sun or reciprocity failure. Those photographers would gladly trade some of their hard-earned cash and some image quality to get a faster lens, and that way they could use a faster shutter speed. That's where Petzval comes along, and he gives photographers an f4 lens option. It's 4 stops brighter than what they had before. Now we can use a shutter speed that's 1, 2, 3, 4 stops darker. We've just gone from almost half an hour to a 1 minute exposure, which seems far more reasonable. Way more practical, and even with modern equipment, an extra 4 stops in natural light gets you from a blurry moving subject to a sharp one. A wider aperture lets more light in so we can have a faster shutter speed, and that's at the expense of a narrower depth of field. There's less in focus. We've all convinced ourselves that blurry backgrounds are desirable, and at least it's one way to get subject separation from the background. What is a portrait lens? It's a lens full of wonderful compromises. It's got a wide aperture to let in lots of light so you can get faster shutter speeds. It's one that doesn't need to be sharp from corner to corner because that doesn't matter in a portrait. And it's one that makes you, the photographer, stand in the right place for the right shot.